In polytheistic religions, such as the belief in the Greek gods like Zeus and Hera, or Norse gods like Freya and Thor, gods often have distinguishable gender profiles, which allows for a gendered and often very sexual dynamic when they interact with each other and with human beings. If we think of this in the context of religious traditions around the world and we see how different they are, you see that in many Asian and African religious traditions, for instance, deities are often female or feminine gendered. Consider the Egyptian goddess Isis, the Indian goddess Kali or Durga, the Nigerian goddess Allah, or the Chinese goddess Nua, all of whom represent forces of life and death, fertility and energy, and are credited in some cases with the act of creation itself. Athena and Freya are goddesses of war and wisdom, ideas that are traditionally represented as male.
In the big monotheistic religions of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, you could say that theologically the gender of God is a lot more elusive and less simple, that simple being male. So in the Bible, for instance, God has been compared to a mother who does not forget the child she nurses, a seamstress making clothes for Israel to wear, or a woman working leaven into bread. In Islam, it is considered blasphemous to refer to Allah as something that is either male or female. In fact, in the Quran, Allah is referred to by what are strictly speaking genderless pronouns, even though they most often are translated into English as he. In Hinduism, believers speak of God as a genderless absolute or Brahman, or even as an androgynous entity that is both male and female at the same time. However, much of the discourse of religion in the past few centuries has been dominated by the public and cultural discourse of God as male. There's an important connection between this discourse that genders God as a man and the concept of patriarchy.
You could say that when these religions became influential, they were driven by men and patriarchal societies of their time who concluded that an almighty being with power over everyone and everything must naturally be male. It is possible at the same time to say with equal truth that once the male God was posited as natural, patriarchy founded its authority upon the maleness of God and his male prophets and preachers. We could say that religion and patriarchy share a very dialectical relationship, each feeding off of and gendering of the other. So you might ask how this affects the organization of society, social notions of power and hierarchy, and the ways in which these are gendered. Well, let's take a look at the example of Renaissance England, the source of so much of the foundation of the cultural bases of the modern world. According to E.M.W. Tilliard, one part of the answer comes from history, more specifically 16th century England during Elizabethan times or the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. This is a time in history in which Great Britain is busy expanding and colonizing the rest of the world. So it's no wonder that whatever worldviews were cultivated in Britain had potentially far-reaching influence. Tilliard speaks of an Elizabethan worldview centered around something called the Great Chain of Being, which is a divine order or a hierarchy based on a balance of spirit and matter. This chain of being looked something like this: God at the top, angels, humanity, animals, then plants, and then just matter. So politically, the chain would organize seats of power, like this. You would have God, then the Pope, then the king's subjects, male, and then the women who were wives of the male subjects, then children, then animals, and then plants. So at this time, women had very little control over their own role in society. They were expected to act submissively in their homes and in public, quietly attend to the domestic duties such as child rearing and household chores. As scholar Jean Addison Roberts points out, women were seen as closer than men to animals in the great chain of being. In the great chain of being, all of creation was seen as being bound together. Whatever affected one thing affected other things in the chain of being. This is called correspondence, a concept perhaps best expressed by Swiss physician Paracelsus, who said, "What is below is like that which is above. What is above is like that which is below." You might remember from your elementary level mathematics the relationship A is to B as B is to C. So thus the relationship of power between any two items on the list remains the same. And what this means is that the relationship between God and the angels is the same as the relationship between angels and humanity, which is the same as the relationship between man and woman, a hierarchical relationship.
Belief in this chain of being was static. This meant that monarchy was ordained by God and inherent in the structure of the universe. In the same way, this meant that the hierarchical relationship between men and women was also divinely ordained, meaning that there would have been no rational way during this time to argue that women ought to have the same rights as men. Such a notion would quite simply have been inconceivable. And very conveniently, the great chain of being, as the world picture, ordained that women could no more rebel against men than men could against their king or the king against God. For a woman to rebel against a man was, in effect, to rebel against God. Obviously, this worked only if God was a man. So in this way, you could argue that the concept of God as male serves to define men and male roles and to enforce the inferior definition and roles of women. The interesting thing about the Elizabethan era, therefore, was to see the many ways in which a king, Henry VIII, rebelled against the Pope, and a woman, his daughter Elizabeth, became king. So this is what makes it such an interesting example of social and cultural impact of the gendering of God and the perpetuation of patriarchy.